Hello and welcome to week 9 of World History. We're going to start off a little bit away from Europe today, but get back to the Europe and the British Isles for some of the strangest stories of the Renaissance. We're going to start off in India, most notably northern India, and talk about the Mughal dynasty. Again, kind of tell you what's going on in other parts of the world while Europe's thoughts are being changed by the Renaissance and, of course, concurrently the Protestant Reformation. We've only looked briefly at India to this point. Basically, India was geographically and otherwise kind of victimized by all this, a victim of bad location. They were conquered very many times over the course of the several hundred years before and even during the Renaissance. We've talked about some of the other empires, the Safavid Empire of Persia, mostly Shiites, the Ottoman Empire of Turkey, Sunni Muslims, and the region in northern India was conquered eventually by the Mughal dynasty, and we'll tell you a little bit more about them. Northern India had been conquered by Genghis Khan, the Huns, the Persians, the descendants of Genghis Khan. Again, this is a region that is just in the way of a whole lot of conquerors over the several centuries. Hinduism, the primary religion of India, was still the primary region of the northern part of India as well, but because of the heavy Muslim influence, Muslim and Hinduism, or Islam and Hinduism, really get mixed a lot up in this culture. I shouldn't say mixed up a lot, but they blended. Much like we talked about the Mali Empire in Western Africa, how it had a lot of the tribal customs that were fused with Islam because of Islamic conquerors. Same thing kind of happened in northern India where they fused Islam and Hinduism. Babur was the first of the conquerors of what would become the Mughal Empire, and he was the first leader of it. Without getting into too much detail, just suffice to say that the Mughal Empire was very strong, but for a very brief period of time in northern India. You'll see some of the maps I'm sharing here and some of the timelines, and they'll give you kind of an idea of how frequently this, or how quick this dynasty came to rise and to fall. Under the Mughal dynasty, though, again, much like the Renaissance was taking over Europe, a lot of the Mughal leaders began to bring law to parts of India, which had been, fairly lawless to this point. Akbar, the grandson of Babur, tried to even formally offer a mixed religion of Hinduism and Islam. It didn't really catch on, but one of the other marks of the Mughal Empire was spectacular architecture. And if you're going to talk about architecture, the one that is still visited today is, of course, the Taj Mahal. This is actually a mausoleum. This was built in honor of a dead person, a woman. The guy's name who built it was Shah Jahan. He was wealthy and enjoyed fine architecture. He was not a leader or military leader, just a very wealthy man. And when he lost his favorite wife in 1621, again, this is very much a polygamist culture. This was the one wife he truly loved, though. He began what turned out to be a 22-year-long project to build her an elaborate tomb, and an architectural image of his Islamic belief. Again, the Taj Mahal was built during the Mughal dynasty of India, but you look at it and it is Islamic architecture. It's the dome, the cutaways, some of the inlays. It is clearly Islamic, and the marble that was brought in to build this was brought in from all corners of Asia, so heavy it had to be brought in on the backs of elephants. Again, the Shah Jahan truly loved his wife, and she actually died giving birth to their 14th child. So, they were busy, I suppose. It has come to symbolize the Mughal dynasty, but also the decline of the Mughal dynasty. Lots of infighting about the time the Taj Mahal was built, so it has kind of a mixed history in India. Although, of course, today we can certainly appreciate the magnificent architecture and just the sheer manpower that went in to build what is essentially a mausoleum. I don't believe you can go inside today. They have walking tours of the outside, but the inside of the mausoleum, I think, is off limits. All right, let's go back to Britain and talk more about the British line of kings, and probably the most famous of all the British kings of all time, Henry VIII. He was an odd character. I liken him to David from the Bible, King David, insofar as he was very artistically inclined, very smart, very impulsive. With all the good and bad that implies. David did a lot of good and a lot of bad. Henry VIII did a lot of bad, some good, but he was just so impulsive as a king, and it marked a very tumultuous time. Again, he was the second monarch of what was called the Tudor House of Tudor. If you recall our lesson on the War of the Roses, you'll know that the House of Tudor was formed as a compromise between the remnants of the House of York and the House of Lancashire, who had battled during the War of Roses. Henry VII was the first king of the Tudor dynasty, and Henry VIII grew up most of his life never knowing he was going to be king because he had an older brother. But his older brother died when Henry was 15, and so all of a sudden, at the age of 15, it dawned on him he was going to be king, whether he wanted to or not. He also took his brother's wife. This is important. Catherine of Aragon. He was only, actually, Henry was only 11, I should say. He was 11 when his brother died at the age of 15. Catherine was his brother's age, 15. So this was a marriage. It was a betrothal at first because Henry was only 11. She was 15. But they actually liked each other as friends even before that. So, again, these are awkward situations that royal marriages create sometimes. But Catherine of Aragon was actually from Spain. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen couple who financed Columbus's voyage. And she was staunchly Roman Catholic, having grown up in that environment. She and Henry were married for nearly 20 years. They had lots of children, but only one of them survived, a daughter named Mary. Later, she would become known as Bloody Mary. We'll talk about that later. It's an interesting and very gruesome story. Henry, though, wanted a son. He wanted a son to carry on the lineage, and it haunted Henry that he could not get a son. He actually started to worry that he had run afoul of God, because he found this verse in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, which reads, "If a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." Well, Henry believed that he had been wrong to marry Catherine to begin with, and that they were without a son because she had been his brother's wife. Based on that fact, he petitioned Cardinal Wolsey, the head of the Church of England, to annul his marriage, which basically is more than just a divorce. It says the marriage never happened. Catherine was devastated because she evidently still had very strong feelings for Henry, and this had to be just a major blow to her. This put Cardinal Wolsey in a tough position because he had to get the approval of Pope Clement VII, who was trying to curry favor with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. As it turned out, Charles V was Catherine of Aragon's uncle. It gets a little complicated, doesn't it? So the poor Cardinal Wolsey was in a absolute no-win situation, and he sort of hemmed and hawed for a while until Henry had enough, and he fired the cardinal, even though he had no legal right to do so. But in 1529, he said, nah. And then he took the matter to a small court who granted him the annulment. In that same year, he hired someone named Sir Thomas More to take Wolsey's place as the cardinal, the Lord Chancellor of England. He expected More to back him up, obviously, and grant him the official annulment that he wanted, but this didn't happen. More did not believe in it. He believed the marriage should not be annulled. Well, Henry was absolutely furious. Again, this is a very impulsive person, and he began acting impulsively. He coerced a group of bishops to pass a bill declaring that he, King Henry VIII, was now the head of the Church of England, basically giving a big finger in the eye to the Pope at the time. Thomas More was a devout man. He resigned his position as Chancellor and was eventually beheaded for defying the king. We'll get to that story in just a second. Sir Thomas More is a very, very interesting figure, but for the purpose of the Henry VIII story, he's just standing in the king's way. Well, finally, the king appointed an archbishop that would grant him his wish of an annulment. Thomas Cranmer gave Henry the official annulment he wanted, and in 1533, Catherine of Aragon was tucked away to live as an ex-queen. She was cared for, but she didn't like that, obviously. Before the annulment was actually official, though, King Henry remarried in secret. He had had his eyes on this young woman named Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was playing kind of hard to get. The king offered her to be his mistress, basically fooling around while he was still married. She was a devout Catholic, though, and she was not about to do that. She was willing to defy the king, not to fool around with him, I guess, while he was still married to Catherine. Anne was certainly the reason that Henry was so hot, as much as anything else, to get the annulment done with Catherine. Henry evidently, again, he was a very poetic soul. He wrote her lots of long love letters expressing his admiration for her, and it drove Henry nearly crazy not being able to marry Anne Boleyn. But eventually, again, the marriage was annulled, and even before then, Henry actually married Anne Boleyn. After the annulment, Henry, again, acting very impulsively, got in Parliament to go along with what he called the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Succession. Basically, he persuaded Parliament to pass a law that declared the King of England, and not the Pope, as the supreme head of the Church of England, which they still are today. The head of the Church of England is King Charles. The Act of Supremacy and Succession stated that Mary, Henry's daughter, with Catherine, would not inherit the throne. It required all the king's subjects to sign an oath giving any of Henry's future children the right to the throne. As it turned out, Anne had just given birth to a daughter named Elizabeth. But Henry VIII and his first daughter, Mary, were very much estranged at this point. He had pretty much shut her out of the court and not quite disowned her, but she was to him a reminder of what could never be with Queen Catherine. Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn did not last long. He just as quickly as he fell in love with her, he fell out of love with her. Again, he was very impulsive, impetuous, you might say. He was prone to very, very wild swings of emotion. Anne became very jealous that Henry was clearly courting other women, and as it turned out, the people did not care much for Anne Boleyn. And the people do have a say here. Again, you might think that the rank-and-file people are absolutely peasant or absolutely powerless against the king, and usually the case, but popular opinion is a thing. And Anne was pretty well despised by the people for being aloof. Only 3 years into their marriage, Henry decided to do away with Anne. He didn't choose annulment, though. He instead charged Anne with committing adultery and for plotting to kill him. For her crime, Anne was locked in the Tower of London, given the death penalty, and her supposed boyfriends that she supposedly had an affair with, but there was never any proof of that, were executed ahead of her. And she was put to death by beheading. And a week later, Henry had married again. Wife number 3 is Jane Seymour. At one time, she was actually a maid in the king's court. But after 30 years almost of marriage, Henry finally got what he wanted the most, a son named Edward. Unfortunately, he lost Jane in the process. She died just 12 days after Prince Edward was born. And Henry, who had evidently grown very fond of Jane, was absolutely devastated. Jane, in her short time as the queen, had really won the hearts of the people, and had helped Henry reconcile with his daughter, oldest daughter Mary. Mary was brought back into court. So Jane was apparently having quite a positive impact on Henry, and it was very tragic that she died 12 days after giving birth to Edward. Meantime, our old friend, the Archbishop Cranmer, the one who actually eventually granted Henry the annulment he was looking for, and a secretary by the name of Thomas Cromwell were getting very involved in this Protestant Reformation thing going on in Germany. They saw what was happening in the wake of Martin Luther's activity, where Germany was sort of as a nation really rejecting the Roman Catholic Church, and they wanted a little bit of that for England. They thought that the island of the British Isles should be separate from Rome, and to cut ties, or at least to greatly diminish them. Now, Henry was not a big religious reformer guy. He was looking out for Henry, and he supported this insofar as it would lessen the Catholic Church's influence in England and increase his. So from that perspective, Henry was all for it. He was not big on doctrine, what have you, Protestant versus Catholic. But anyway, they did manage to push, Cromwell and Cranmer managed to push Protestantism towards England. Henry went along with it, of course, because he got to the land and the wealth of all the Catholic monasteries and nunneries that he shut down. He made changes in the church that seemed to be for his own good. His interests were not in true reform. His interests were, how can King Henry VIII get more powerful? And so it goes. Cromwell, though, again, he was interested genuinely in church reform, though it may have been for more political reasons than anything else. He did come up with an idea, again, to strengthen their alliance with Germany, this nation where the Protestant Reformation is really taking hold, and they're getting independence from the Catholic Church. He said, well, why don't we marry the king to a German princess and strengthen this alliance? Her name was Anne of Cleves. This marriage, according to Cromwell, would benefit England and unite them with Germany, and Henry agreed to the marriage after he saw a portrait of Anne that was painted by his good friend, the very famous painter Hans Holbein. Anne of Cleves, though, this is kind of funny, actually. She was, of course, portrayed as a very beautiful young woman. She was not beautiful. She looked nothing like her portrait. It's a funny thing. I mean, it's not funny. It's sad. But I mean, he bought a car without seeing it first. She was much older than she appeared to be in the picture. She could hardly speak English, which didn't do her any goods. Yeah, they lived in the same house, but Henry had no interest at all in her. And of course, Henry being Henry, had the marriage annulled 6 months later. Again, he's head of the Church of England. He can do whatever he wants to. Henry was kind enough to have Anne provided for the rest of his life. She continued to live in England on a nice budget. She was not taken care of like some of Henry's other wives were. But Thomas Cromwell, the man who set all this up, Henry had him beheaded. Henry was very impulsive. He was not a good guy. He was not a good guy to get angry. On the same day as Cromwell's execution, Henry married again. We're on wife number 5. Catherine Howard was number 5's name. And believe it or not, in 2 years, this marriage failed as well. This time, though, it was not so much Henry as it was Catherine. She was pretty foolish and immature, and she cheated on Henry, which is not a smart thing to do. He confessed. She was beheaded for her crime, as were her lover and someone else who apparently covered up the secret. So at least in this respect, you couldn't blame Henry on it, because it was clearly Catherine Howard who was unfaithful. That means she has to be killed for it, but again, we're talking Henry VIII. Henry's love life would finally settle down with wife number 6, Catherine Parr. 31-year-old woman, was 20 years younger than Henry was at the time. She was, by all accounts, warm, caring, intelligent. She took part. She was really a mother to all 3 of the royal children. She genuinely loved them. This stable marriage lasted for the final few years of Henry's life. Catherine was a Protestant, And Henry, of course, he had broken from the Catholic Church, but he was a Protestant insofar as it benefited him. Henry, though, died at the age of 55, about 4 years after he and Catherine Parr were married. He's buried at Windsor Castle. Now, what do we make of this tempestuous 35 plus years or so of rule under Henry VIII and the 6 different queens that we had to deal with here? Again, early in his life, Henry was a very promising person. He was very bright. He could speak 3 languages. He was believed to be one of the most educated kings to ever sit on a throne anywhere. Most expected him to be like a lot of the de Medicis and Da Vinci's were in Florence, and being this educated Renaissance man, man of many talents. Henry was not interested in that, though. He left a lot of the day-to-day duties of ruling the kingdom to other people while he went hunting, dancing. Most of England, though, liked Henry very much. He was a sort of a man of the people kind of guy, so he had a very positive public image. He ordered Bibles written in English to be placed in all of the churches of England. Again, we're getting away even more and more from the orthodoxy of the Catholic Church. He used Bibles to promote British nationalism and independence from Rome. So while he was not interested in reforming the Roman Church, he just wanted England to be free of the Pope, and as a result of that, him being able to do whatever the heck he wanted to. He was not a reformer. He was a tyrant, no doubt about it. Under and thousands of people were put to death. Again, though, he still managed to remain fairly popular with the people. His children are another story. A very complicated one. Henry VIII wrote in his will that Prince Edward would be the next king. If he died, Mary would replace him, and if she died, Elizabeth would replace her. And that's exactly what happened. Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, the Tudors, the 3 Tudor kings. We will be talking about each of them, of course 2 queens I should say in that. We'll be talking about them because they are big parts of British history as well. Each change on the throne was messy because Henry's children all had different religious beliefs. Keep that in mind. Let's backtrack and talk more about Sir Thomas More, the Chancellor of the Church of England, who was eventually beheaded for defying Henry's wish to have his first marriage with Catherine of Aragon annulled. Thomas More was a spectacular figure. He was a lawyer and a writer. In addition to being a religious reformer, he was very, very devout. He was Catholic, very, very Catholic. And he was friends with our old buddy, the writer Erasmus. Remember him in Praise of Folly? Dude that I really admire because he sort of wrote what he thought and did not really care about what the powerful had to say about his writing. I respect that. In fact, Erasmus dedicated In Praise of Folly to Sir Thomas More. It tells you how close of friends they were. They were very different in faith, though. Erasmus was... He was a Christian, but he was one that was not on board with Catholic doctrine necessarily. He was very humanist in his Christian beliefs, very almost secular, if there is such a thing, very worldly. Sir Thomas More was straight up Roman Catholic. His great interest was law. He was a lawyer, like we said, and he was... by all accounts, fair, gracious, but uncompromising. Sir Thomas More was also quite the writer. You have heard the phrase utopia. That is the title of a Sir Thomas More book in 1516. Again, right about the time Da Vinci was rocking and rolling in Venice. This great piece of literature was a fictional story. It combined a couple of Greek words to mean... to come up with a word that means no place, because this place doesn't exist. It's too perfect to exist. Utopia. Of course, we use utopia today to describe any fictional society that's seen as idyllic, perfect, too good to be true. It's really a look at the ups and downs of civilization and socialization. It's actually a very, very deep work. that anyone can identify with. It's not written in high prose or anything. It's just, it brings up some good universal questions, questions that we are still struggling with today. He wove real characters with fictional characters to tell this story. The idea is that he's talking with friends about a journey to the new world, which of course is a thing now. On the journey, that is, he supposedly lands on the island of Utopia, where everything is quote unquote perfect. Utopians don't punish thieves; they prevent theft altogether. According to the people on the island, they do that by prevent people from stealing money because money and possessions are spread evenly among them. Okay. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? The cool thing about Sir Thomas More is he doesn't express an opinion in Utopia. He wants you to decide, is this a good thing that people have to have the same amount of everything as everyone else? So if someone's found to have more, they got to have it taken away from them, so everyone's the same. If it prevents theft, is that a good thing? Anyway, other philosophical debates are created by looking at this fictional place. The sailors on Utopia point out that everyone's happy when they follow the golden rule. He points out that's all fine and good, but the traveler, Sir Thomas More, says there's no personal freedom in Utopia. Everyone's told what to do and when to do it for the betterment of all. The Utopians work 6 hours a day, sleep 8 hours, and are allowed leisure time in between, which usually includes reading. The Utopians all grow gardens, they aren't allowed to litter, and they move to the country every few years so they can learn to farm. War is frowned upon except for self-defense. Gold and silver are used every day for things, so people won't grow greedy for them because they're so common, I suppose. The rest of the book deals with the issues of slave, religion, marriage, and clothes. The people of Utopia have only two sets of clothing for certain occasions. So again, everybody has exactly two. No one has more than two. Wouldn't want someone to be ostentatious. Again, everybody's equal. He's making the point that some rulers would love to try to completely run other people's lives if they could. That if left unchecked, most every ruler in history would love a society like this. Why? Because everyone's lives are regulated. And when they're regulated, someone else is regulating them, and it's the people in power. Some results would be good and practical, More suggests, but others would be rigid and ridiculous. As someone who's a libertarian and who cherishes individual liberty, this is probably my version of hell. But again, we are still struggling and will always struggle with the proper role of government and oversight balanced with individual liberty. Where we draw that line, we'll always be debating that. After writing Utopia, More had some more serious things. He was very much, like I said, very Catholic. He was hired by the church to put down heretics and reformers. He was knighted for his service. And again, eventually he got favor with Henry and was appointed to the de facto archbishop position. And Henry wanted him to grant the annulment, and he stood his ground. He would not sign the oath or grant it. And when asked why, he maintained his silence, because to say anything would have been treason against the king. He actually respected Henry. He did not want to openly defy him, but he was not going to go along with this because he felt it was against his religion. Henry gave him every chance to recant. He did not, and eventually he was put to death. Sir Thomas More was referred to as the king's good servant, but God's servant first. Not a bad way to be remembered. The Roman Catholic Church named him a saint in the year 1935. We're going to talk an awful lot about this madness in Britain when we meet on Monday. See you then.